Welcome to the latest episode of E+T Off the Page podcast. Jack and Tanya today are joined by a special guest, Professor Karen Polizzi, to talk about biotechnology and if it is living up to its billing as the most exciting technology around. Here's my starting point with this. In the film The Graduate, at his graduation party, a family friend pulls Dustin Hoffman to one side and sagely says he has one word for him: plastics. Information that the young Dustin Hoffman is completely disinterested in. Now, that was set in the mid-60s, and it was in hindsight a sound bit of advice. Perhaps the only better bit of advice might have been electronics, in that that's the foundation of the latest digital industrial revolution. But so, about 10, 20 years or so ago, biotechnology was being uttered in the same way as plastics had been in that film. Biotech was going to fundamentally change everything. Not just where you might expect it to in agriculture and medicine, but in energy, manufacturing, even computing as well, potentially superseding electronics. So I'm going to say that it hasn't reached such lofty heights, but progress on a realistic scale has been remarkable, particularly in the field of genetics. So joining the E+T crew of Jack Loughran and Tanya Weaver today is Karen Polizzi, who is Professor of Biotechnology in the Department of Chemical Engineering at Imperial College London. So maybe, Karen, you could give me a more informed version of my oversimplified report card. Has biotechnology to date lived up to its hype?
I definitely have to say yes, because it's my field of study, and otherwise I've wasted a lot of my time. But I think if we look at the world around us, there are definitely places where biotechnology has had a good influence and has really broadened what we can do and how long we can live and how healthy we can be. So definitely yes.
Where would you say the biggest breakthroughs are happening? It feels that in terms of pushing back the science, then genomics or genetics is a cutting edge. But in terms of commercial and societal use, it's in agriculture where it's making most progress, perhaps, or pharmaceutical medicine. What do you think?
I think a lot of the early breakthroughs have been in medicine, and that's for a couple of different reasons. One is that biology can make things that are incredibly complicated much better than we can do with chemistry. And so if you think about some of the drug molecules that people need for treatments, they are very difficult to make by chemical synthesis. It would take very, very many steps, but biological systems can make them much more easily. Also, those types of things tend to be taken in very, very small doses, so you don't have such a problem with the vast scale that you would need to manufacture something on. So you can make small amounts of it and it still does people good. And then the third reason is really that in terms of the economics, the types of things you use as inputs to a biological system to make medicines are inexpensive, and the output, the medicine, is expensive, so that works out in terms of economic terms to give a company incentive in there. But I think now people are very much interested in sustainability and climate change, so we're starting to see a lot more research and early companies thinking about how we can replace the things that we get from petrochemicals like plastics or other materials with bio-based solutions, and I think that research will come online. And there's also an interest in agriculture and food systems in terms of being able to make things within a country that may have limited land area, making proteins in biotechnology systems that people can eat and have benefits. So again, that's early stage research, but I think we'll see it coming through soon.
So I was thinking about this when it comes to kind of agriculture and that kind of thing. I remember being a kid in the 90s and there was the mouse with the ear on its back, and there was Dolly, the cloned sheep and stuff. And there were these quite high-profile examples of biotechnology kind of entering the news. And it kind of pointed towards like a slightly scary future when it came to agriculture and things. But I think since then, I wouldn't say there's been anything necessarily equivalent to that, which I'd say is, that's been all over the news and so on. Did that come to anything? I mean, why aren't we cloning cows? Why aren't we growing human organs on other animals?
Well, just to pick up on that, then people, for that very reason, aren't always happy with this area of research, are they? There's a Luddite approach to it, if you like. They're not sure where the technology is going to lead, or the impact of that technology further down the line, perhaps. And when it comes to, you're talking about genetically modified crops, for example, we don't have any at all in this country, do we? I believe. Whereas things like soya bean and corn throughout the world, the majority of them are genetically modified. Going back to Jack's point, do we still have reason to have caution about these sorts of things?
Well, I think it's exactly what you said. There was some lack of public acceptance, I guess, is a way to say it. So I think things like putting an ear on a mouse really shock people, and they think, why would you ever want to do that? And really, if you think about it, there is no material benefit from that other than showing that you can do it. And so I think if there's not a strong need for that type of engineering in a population, which in Europe and in the US where I'm from, most people can feed themselves at a reasonable cost and price. The public opinion then going against technology like that prevents it from being adopted. But I think it doesn't have to be quite as extreme as that example, right? So it could be things like drought-resistant crops, things like increasing vitamin content of rice. So there was a project called Golden Rice, which was trying to make rice more nutritious. And in areas of the world where nutrition deficiencies happen and where food isn't as abundant, I think there is a need for that. But for example, I have some collaborators in Kenya, and for a long time, the government there adopted a strategy that, well, if it's not something that's publicly acceptable in Europe and regulators in Europe have banned it, then there must be something wrong with this technology, and therefore we should not adopt it here because it's not going to be good for our population. So I think a lot of it is wrapped up in that. There have been some changes now in the way people think about this technology and what they do. So it's possible now with new ways of doing genome engineering to do very small changes, which are much more natural rather than these large-scale changes that people were doing before. And it's just sort of nudging things along the path that they would probably take with evolution anyway, just getting there a little bit faster. And there, because the changes are smaller, I think it's potentially a little bit more acceptable and less shocking. But again, a dialogue has to be had within each population. Is this of benefit to us? What are the drawbacks? And then a decision has to be made.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that it's the sort of manipulating. You think you got these crops and it's the manipulation and it's not natural maybe, and it's the misinformation around that. But then of course we have, we're going to have a huge population, 10 billion in 2050, the UN said, I think. So, we've got to feed the world somehow, and this is a solution, possibly.
Yeah, it is definitely a possible solution, and I think the land that is available for farming will become scarce at some point. So even if we wanted to continue with current agricultural practices, we wouldn't be able to as the population increases. And then there are, the potential to try to undo some of the less healthy effects of the way systems are grown. So for example, runoff into streams that can cause algal blooms and things like that. If we could avoid using fertilizers on such a large scale because the crops don't need quite as much, we could then, sort of keep that contamination out of the waterways and things like that. So there are definitely benefits.
Yeah.
And then there's a new area of research that's also thinking about, can you take the whole process into a bioreactor or a big tank? So, the cultivated meat that's coming online now, I think we're quite away from that being adopted, but I think research going on into that. Then it wouldn't matter where you're putting that tank. So it could be in a building without having to worry about whether that land is habitable for an animal or something like that.
I wanted to bring that up because just recently there's a new centre that's been launched, which you're a part of, which is the National Alternative Protein Innovation Centre. And so you're leading that in terms of applying engineering, biology and AI to accelerate the development of proteins. So is that going to be something we're all going to be eating lab-grown meats in the future?
I think probably we're not all going to be eating lab-grown meat in the future. And the idea is not really to completely displace conventional farming totally. I think there are two different activities going on in Imperial. So one is focused on engineering biology, which is about the systems that you use to do genetic modification and AI applied to these things. The National Alternative Protein Innovation Center, NAPIC, is more about thinking about how you could mass produce some of the discoveries that have been made, whether they be in lab-grown meat or in things that are more conventional, such as, plant-based proteins, or what's called precision fermentation, but is really fungal systems being grown in tanks and making alternatives that people can eat that have complete nutrition in the way that meat does, but without being sourced from animals.
Could you give us a little rundown of how the lab-grown meat industry is progressing at the moment? Because I remember reading, say, probably nearly a decade ago, by 2022 we'll all be eating lab-grown meat and it'll be available in the supermarkets and so on. And obviously it's not really come to pass. The last thing I read, I think, was in Asia, maybe like Singapore or somewhere, there was a company developing like prawn meat or shrimp meat, because that's quite a uniform meat. It's actually quite easy to grow in the lab. But again, I haven't really heard anything else about that, and there's certainly nothing that I can see when I go into Tesco's. I can't see any lab-grown burgers. So what's happening? Like, how long is it going to be?
You're correct that some of the initial companies have gotten market approval to sell products. It started in Singapore. There are a couple in the US, and there are some in the UK that are working towards regulatory approval. And I think you hit exactly on it. So shrimp, as an example, being relatively simple, not that hard to reproduce the texture and the different things involved in it, has been an early success. I think if you think about some of the things that we do eat, if you eat meat at all, actually, you might be a vegetarian or a vegan, but some of the meats products that are out there are very, very highly structured in them, and reproducing that with cells that are grown outside of an animal is very, very difficult. And I think that has been one of the technological hurdles. There's also been a bit of a cost hurdle. So the kinds of things that you need to feed cells to get them to grow to a high density to be able to make a measurable amount of, say, a burger or a sausage or something like that, they're very, very expensive inputs. And the cost of meat needs to be something that people are willing to pay for, right? So if it's more expensive than a conventional chicken breast, then people aren't going to necessarily choose to eat cultivated chicken breast unless they believe personally that it's better for the environment or something like that. So they have a personal driver for it.
I have read, in 2015, whatever year it was, the first lab-grown hamburger cost $100,000 or whatever, and now it's down to kind of less than 50. So the cost has dropped phenomenally in the last 10 years or so. Is that a trend that is just set to continue until it really does appear on the shelves of supermarkets and so on?
Yeah, I think it definitely will continue. I think there are still gains to be had in terms of efficiencies in the process and coming up with new inputs that are cheaper. So, for example, maybe sourcing amino acids from a less pure source, if the process could take something like that and you still would get a good product out there. But all of that takes sort of painstaking research to know whether it's okay, whether there are any residual things in there. And especially around things, food and medicine both, being very, very careful about public safety. So making sure that none of the choices that are made will result in harm to the consumer. But I think we will continue to see costs decrease. It may not be on the same trajectory. So it's been a very, very sharp decrease in costs, which I think is actually parallels quite a lot to the developments that happened in the pharmaceutical industry between the 80s and, say, 2000. Things went down in cost a lot because they went from being able to make sort of hundreds of milligrams per mil, so very tiny, tiny amounts, to being able to make tens of grams in the same volume. So when you multiply something like that, then the cost goes down. And so I think something similar has been happening in the cultivated meat. And then it sort of shallows out, right? So you've gotten the quick wins. You've figured out the most efficient ways to do things to cut costs. And then there's still some efficiency to be had there.
I think, as Tim was saying at the beginning, why were we promised this and nothing's happening? But I think it's also, it takes a long time. Like, as you said, with the meat alternatives, it's not like we've thought of this and now it's in the lab and because it's the same with gene editing or, medicines. It takes so long to get something from, the R&D process and getting it through all the clinical trials and out. So is that a reason why? I mean, it's the cost, but also the time it takes.
Yeah, I mean, I think research with biological systems does take a long time. There's a lot of unknown still, even in cells that have been studied for a very long time. For example, baker's yeast. People were using that, 10,000 years ago to make beer and make bread without really realizing there was any microorganism in there, right? They just knew if you took a little bit from the batch before and put it into the next batch that the loaf would rise because of the carbon dioxide being made. So even yeast, which we've been using a long time, and we know pretty much all of the genes and all of the proteins in it, we still don't quite understand how everything's interconnected. And so when we want to make a genetic change to that, we don't fully know. We can't predict exactly how it would play out. So we make it, and then sometimes there's an unexpected surprise. The cells will randomly die or something like that. You have to unpick what is the problem and go back. And for systems that we know less about, animals are very complex. So animal cells are less well understood than yeast, and therefore it takes a long time. And then there's also, wanting to make sure that you don't have any unintended consequences, making sure that everything is safe and accepted by the public as well.
So I'm going to throw in another dated film reference. Life will find its way, and that was one of the tags that we used in the Jurassic Park, of course. Yes, Dr. Ian Malcolm. But that's one of the headlines we used in an article in the last issue. We had 3 or 4 articles about biotechnology. This was principally looking at synthetic fuels. You mentioned how scaling up things using bioreactors, for example. people have found that, as I understand it, a lot more difficult than they originally thought. They could do things in the lab, but the life will find its way reference, of course, is that when you start to scale it up, the cells start misbehaving and reverting to how evolution intended. This is something that you've looked into. It's discovery to delivery, isn't it? Your program that you presented to the World Economic Forum a few years ago.
Just to butt in, by bioreactors, you mean like creating energy through biological organisms?
It's just creating a reaction at a much bigger scale than a lab. Is that right, Karen?
Yeah, so in the laboratory, we would use small volumes of things, maybe go up to a liter or so, something like that. But if you want to think about, growing meat to feed the world or something like that, you need tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of liters in a batch. And so a lot of these things are done in very large tanks made of stainless steel, with things being input and samples being taken and things being stirred and oxygen being provided and things like that. So when we say bioreactor in the field, we usually are referring to these kinds of tanks.
Okay.
What about the thought about the life will find its way, how cells will not behave themselves properly necessarily?
I love that quote. It's a little scary to me that I'm getting old because I don't think it's that dated. It's kind of, something that I remember. I was already an adult when that film came out. But then I think in general, I love that quote because life will find a way because it is so resilient. But I think because it is so resilient, sometimes when you're trying to do something that is not the original goal of the organism, not to completely anthropomorphize there, but, it will find a way around it if it's something that's too stressful or that takes away energy from its own growth. And these big tanks that I was talking about before are really kind of a very stressful environment. They're not very well mixed, and so they're not very homogeneous. There may be areas of low oxygen. The cells are essentially suffocating when they're in that sort of area. And so they're undergoing all of these changes. Whereas when we do things in the laboratory in small volumes, we can provide enough air without any problem. We can mix everything really well, so there are no gradients or anything like that. So when we put them in the stressful environment, a lot of times the cells will actually not behave the way that we expect. They'll mutate the genetic modifications that have been made back to something that allows them to grow a bit faster. And if you even imagine a population of 100, if that mutation allows the cell to grow faster, it quickly overtakes all the others because it's got an advantage there. And that's how natural evolution works. But unfortunately, this is evolution in one of the bioreactors going in a direction towards the cell living and not necessarily making the thing that we want. But it is possible to get around this. You can develop systems where the cell's goal of growing and your goal of the production are aligned, or you can try to design things so that they're not quite as strong in terms of the effect that they have on the cells, and then there's less of a drive for evolution to silence or prevent the cells from making it.
I've got some research written down here from the Capgemini Research Institute, and in a recent survey of large companies across diverse industries, they say 96% are looking into using biotechnology. 99% will be making sweeping changes to their industry over the next 5 to 10 years. And 70% will say that it will contribute significantly towards meeting their environmental goals. So it strikes me that there's a parallel here between biotech and artificial intelligence. Everybody thinks it's the answer, but not many companies have the in-house expertise to develop that technology for themselves. So if you're given that the readers of E+T magazine and our podcast listeners, they are technical people, they're engineers, they're working in these big companies, but not necessarily biotech companies. How do the rest of that sector get in touch with the capabilities of what biotech has to offer, and how is it applicable to them?
I think this is something that within the last 20 years or so, the field has really been thinking about. So there's been a move towards open access and open source technologies where anyone who wants to use something can have access to it. So this helps not only for smaller companies competing with larger companies, but also countries where they might not have as many resources having access to things. It still doesn't necessarily solve the challenge of knowing what to do, but it gives you access to some of the tools that you can use to do it. So some of the genetic pieces or DNA or things like that. And there are also now starting to be what's known as hack spaces in the field. So these are community laboratories, essentially, where people can go and sort of muck around in the lab for a while, do some very simple experiments, learn some very easy things. One of the classic things here is to take a genetic construct and put it into cells so that they make a protein that glows green. This is GFP for those who are familiar with it, won a Nobel Prize. It's a very easy to see protein. It's kind of a fun experiment. It's relatively simple to do. So these community laboratories are focused on teaching people the basics. I think, again, this might not necessarily be I can't imagine a very large company sending someone to a hack space if they wanted to learn it. I think what they would do would be hire in expertise from new graduates, of which, there are quite a few. So I guess this is around the time where most people have finished their degrees and are out looking for employment. So I could recommend some graduates if any of your listeners are looking for somebody with biotech knowledge. But I think biology in general is touching a lot of fields, so not just manufacturing, but also physics, chemistry, things like that. So it is a science that's starting, I think, to pervade a lot of other science and engineering fields.
On that note, if kind of no one had heard of lab-grown meat 20 years ago, and now that's the forefront that's kind of in the media, is there something you could point to that's like maybe the next forefront of biotech that maybe people aren't talking about at the moment, but in, say, 5 or 10 years, maybe that will be the next big thing?
I personally am very interested in applying this kind of stuff to conservation efforts. So there are a lot of species that are dying out, largely because of human activity and changes to their habitat or destruction of their habitat. And if we are able to sort of, correct the behavior of cells in these big vats, could we start to help these organisms by engineering them to be able to overcome some of the things that we've done to their environment? Or on the flip side, could we clean up the environment and make it the way it was before so that they could live with that? I think the reason why this is maybe something that's on the forefront is because this is something now we're talking about being completely out of the laboratory and out of control. When we have these big vats, if something goes wrong, we can decontaminate and kill everything inside of it, and there's no risk to humans or other species. But if you imagine, trying to go to the Brazilian rainforest and introduce new species there, we could have unintended consequences. So that's a reason why I think it's something more for the future.
That idea of preserving species by genetically altering them, either them or the food that they eat, perhaps, or that's what you're suggesting, that's not going to sit well with a lot of people, is it? The idea of preserving species is exactly that, not adapting them to be part of the new world, if you like.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. It's also possible maybe to undo some of the damage that has been done, so that if they're dying because of changes to their environments, if we can undo the changes to the environment, so, reforest or clean up the water if there's been, contamination of the water with heavy metal, things like that to allow preservation.
Yeah, because climate change has a lot to answer for in terms of that. Environments we're all going to get hotter, wetter, more fires.
But that's one of the areas where biotech could really come into its own, isn't it? In dealing with that, we had an article about the use of algae to, as a carbon capture technology. And I think there's quite a lot of potential in that side, both on the carbon capture side, but also manufacturing and filtering out our outputs to the environment.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is actually kind of correlated with the life will find a way quote that you were talking about before, right? So there are living organisms that can use pretty much anything. So there are organisms like algae and plants that can fix CO2, take it out of the atmosphere and bring it into a living being. There are things that can eat and decontaminate methane. There are things that can take heavy metals up and sequester them into little particles inside the cell. So pretty much anything on Earth that exists, there's at least one organism out there that can use it for its own benefit for growth. And potentially that could be a useful source for trying to fix some of the damage that's happened.
I remember reading quite a long time ago about releasing maybe female mosquitoes that are infertile or whose progeny will be infertile. It was basically a way to try and tackle with some of the mosquito issues, especially in places like Africa where they can spread nasty diseases and things. I think the problem we've always got with something like that is that once you release something like that into the environment, you can't really take it back. And also, even the most complex simulations we can create, there are always potential unintended consequences that you just cannot foresee. Like ecosystems are just too complex to fully model. There were just too many different factors. What do you think about something like that project, for example, releasing genetically modified mosquitoes? Do you think there are cases where it's worth the risk, or do you think that the risk is too great because we'll never actually know the full risk until it's too late?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think that's a really interesting example because you're right. We can't model an ecosystem. We can't even model in a single cell. So if you then think about many, many different organisms all interacting, trying to capture all that in a model, we would never know for sure. So I think there are some ways of trying to think about how you can design these systems for a little bit more safety or user control over them. So, for example, if in addition to being infertile, they also have a susceptibility to something that you could apply to kill the population if things were headed in a way that's out of control, something like that could be a possibility. Kill switches is the term that people use for that, and they've even been proposed for things like microorganisms, so it doesn't have to be a mosquito. I think there were some field trials of the kinds of technology you're talking about. In fact, I think one of them was in the Florida Keys, which is a group of islands in the southern U.S., and I think that was chosen because they knew that the spread of those types of organisms would be limited by the fact that it's an island, so it couldn't necessarily get to the mainland. So possibly also through some clever design of the trial of the technology in that way, we could also maybe try to understand if there were unintended consequences that would be negative.
Time has flown already, so maybe just to conclude, I could loop back to my opening gambit and suppose we've got that slightly creepy family friend of Dustin Hoffman and he's whispering biotechnology in his ear. What would you say is the future for biotech? Jack touched on this earlier, but 10 years in the future, maybe 20 years, what are we going to see in biotech and what's the most exciting aspect of it, do you think?
As I mentioned before, a lot of the real success cases now are medical, but I think 10 years from now we'll have lots of success cases from other areas. So from consumer products, from sustainability, hopefully from cleaning up the atmosphere, carbon capture, using up methane, things like that. I would like to think that there will also be successes in food, both in crops that are able to be more productive with less fertilizer, can have a higher yield per density that's been planted, potentially lab-grown meat and things like that. So I do think that if I were to have money to invest, and sadly Imperial doesn't pay me that much, I would definitely think that biotech is an area just because it's so pervasive and touching so many different things.
Could we talk about COVID? Because I feel like biotech has probably in some ways been in the news since COVID more than it ever has done before in relation to that virus specifically. You don't have to answer this, but what do you make of, say, the Wuhan lab leak theory versus COVID naturally propagating in the environment?
That's an interesting one. So I don't really have enough knowledge to say one way or another, but I do think that what we did see from the COVID experience was people having a better understanding of the potential of biotechnology, right? So this was the fastest development and deployment of a vaccine yet. People also starting to think about the mass manufacture of stuff, which I very much appreciate given the area that I'm interested in. So one of the reasons the mRNA vaccines were so successful was because the doses were relatively small. They can be made relatively simply, and the supply chains, the inputs there are fewer than they would be with a cell-based process. So people really starting to think about these kinds of things. And also the focus on costs. So in a lot of places, the UK, the US, and in Europe, I think no matter what the cost of that vaccine had been, most of the population would have had access to it. But thinking about other countries where that's not the case and how costs of vaccines and manufacturing vaccines can be made more cheaply. I guess you might have brought up the lab leak as an allusion to an unplanned biology getting away from you sort of example. I think if that was the origin, it's unfortunate, but hopefully we'll be able to figure out what went wrong there and the lessons learned if it's proven to be that in the future.
I mean, the thing about China, for example, is that it's very separate from the West, and it's potentially difficult to know exactly what they're doing or what various countries all around the world are doing. I mean, is there kind of a threat of sort of biotech? Is there a looming danger that if it was a lab leak, could we see another virus? Or do you think these are dangers that will continue to rear their ugly head, so to speak, as in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always the danger, and there will definitely be another pandemic of serious consequences, right? So whether that comes from a lab leak or whether it comes from a climate change effect of, something coming from an animal coming in contact with the human population because of overcrowding or land use questions, or whether that comes just from, something like antimicrobial resistance or antiviral resistance developing in something that we can control well now. I'm sure there will be another pandemic, unfortunately, for all of us. I think in terms of looking at the geopolitics of it, I think there were bioweapons programs as far back as the 1950s in most states. I remember when I was a student in epidemiology way back when, we had a course where we were talking about different types of pathogens, and pretty much in the book that we had, unfortunately I can't remember the title anymore, pretty much everything it would say something along the lines of, and the US and Russia had formal weapons programs around this pathogen, but these were discontinued in the 1970s. So I think there's always a danger that states are looking at any advantage they could have against other states. And that's why international cooperation and collaboration is useful, because if everyone's a friend, then they're not going to want to stockpile weapons, which is a very naive thing to say. I think this is why I'm an engineer and a scientist and not in charge of any government. But also, I guess, just knowing what other countries are doing, what kinds of things are being funded, which requires a degree of openness, for sure.
I mean, in terms of the mRNA vaccines, and I mean, they were obviously produced and rolled out in record time. So is that the future of vaccines then, is mRNA? Or, I mean, without going into, I guess, too much technical detail, but can you talk about mRNA a little?
I think the reason why it was rolled out and deployed so quickly is because it had the supply chain that was short, but also because it's a relatively well understood molecule. So mRNA is an intermediary between the genes and the proteins. So the proteins are the main part of the cell that's doing the action. So they're the things that allow you to, metabolize the glucose that you ate in a sandwich, or will allow the cells to grow and divide. And the genes are the ones that store the information. So RNA, and the M stands for messenger. So it's like the intermediary between these. And so the idea with a vaccine is if you then have a message that allows the cells of the patient who's getting the vaccine to make something that looks like the infection, that your immune system is then stimulated to act against that. And so the next time your immune system encounters it in the form of the real pathogen, you're protected. Because it's composed of only 4 molecules in different orders, depending on what the protein is that it's encoding, it's a relatively well understood molecule. And therefore, to make a new RNA vaccine, you just make a message that encodes a new protein. In contrast, if you think about other types of vaccines, most of them are either the organism itself grown up in some of these big vats and then killed so that it can no longer infect someone, but it looks from the outside like it's still alive and your immune system reacts to it, or other pieces of it. So, for example, a protein from the surface of that virus or that bacteria. Those are less well understood. And so when you go to make a lot of them, there's a lot of work that goes into trying to understand for this specific protein or this specific type of organism, how do I efficiently scale that up into the big vats? But with RNA, because you don't need quite as much of it, and because it's such a simple thing, it's much easier to manufacture. I think we're still trying to figure out if it's going to be the panacea for everything, or if the immune system, the durability with that vaccine will be as long as it is with some of the other things. If you think of some of the childhood vaccinations, you get them when you're, sort of 1-2 years old and you never have to have them again. So whether you'll have immune recognition, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later or not, I think is still an open question because they're so new.
Yeah, I mean, when it came to COVID, obviously, I think I personally maybe had 3 or 4 COVID shots. So, I mean, they didn't last forever. Is that just a kind of fallibility of mRNA vaccines, or is there like a path towards making them more long-term?
Yeah, so for this, I'm not sure if it's to do with the COVID virus itself, because remember, it was also changing a lot during time, or whether it's to do with the RNA vaccine. So I'm not really sure. But I think even if it was something that people had to have more frequently, if we can get to a place where we can make them pretty inexpensively, then it might be a good compromise. Or we might later decide that actually this is a technology that we really could be very useful when there's a pandemic, but for kind of routine immunization, we want to stick with more traditional methods.
I just wanted to ask about the role of AI, specifically in sort of drug discoveries and precision medicine. So how is AI sort of accelerating R&D process of new drugs? I think one of the challenges we're always facing is that there are a lot of possibilities. So if you think about a drug molecule, there are some pieces of that are functional and then other pieces that are less. They just happen to coincide with the functional parts. And if you're thinking about trying to
get a more effective drug or one that has better distribution throughout the body or one that has less side effects, you're not necessarily sure which parts are which. And one of the things that AI can do is actually help you to figure that out. So you take a small test set of molecules, you test the effect on cells, and then AI can be used to recognize patterns that a human wouldn't necessarily see, suggest some optimizations or some drug molecules to you that might behave better, and then you can test those. So that's one way in which it's useful. I think another way in which it's useful is for trying to correlate a person's genetics with their propensity for getting disease or having an adverse reaction to specific drugs or things like that. So if you think about the number of genes in someone's body, there are, again, variations in that coding. It's why we all look differently from the outside. We don't know which ones might be associated with disease because there are just too many. So again, the AI can develop hypotheses that can then be tested.
And then that leads to sort of precision medicine. So then you can go, oh, they have got this, let me edit your genes and blah.
So is that a technology that is early days? So it has potential, but it's maybe not kind of completely dominating the pharmaceutical sector at the moment, or?
I mean, I think most pharmaceutical companies probably have now several people devoted to looking into these things because it would make such a big impact on their ability to do business, their ability to treat patients and things like that. Examples of it being used in something coming to market, I think, are probably not quite there yet. But I think part of that is to do with the fact that getting a new drug approved actually takes quite a long time. So, there may be things that have been designed, but they're in clinical trial.
Yeah, because you see lots of that, lots of headlines. When I look at Science Alert, it's like this, Alzheimer's drug, but it's only like in the first stages of clinical trial. So, it takes ages.
All right. Well, thanks very much. There's a news reporter coming out in Jack there. So we will now have to call a close to it. That's been fascinating. Thank you, of course, Professor Polizzi. I really enjoyed your company today. That's it from us. There's plenty more podcasts available on the ENT website. Until the next time, thank you for listening.